Thanks especially to new members since we last did one of these live stream events. Those new members include Greg Alter, Brent Montgomery, Joanne Vanek, Mimi Gurman, Orkun Irgun, I'm pretty sure I mispronounced that, sorry, and Gordon Russell. So thanks everybody for joining in. And already David has a question. Wow, not even done with the acknowledgments. So everyone, what is your most telltale sign of NTHE? Asks David. And I'm just going to put that on hold for a while. Again, thanks to the new members. Again, thanks to everybody who's joining today. I wanted to talk briefly about the information that I provided with the last science update from last Wednesday. And there were 3 papers of note. First of them, Inside Climate News. And the headline from Inside Climate News from January 13th, 2021 reads, "More overheated forests may soon release more Sorry, let me back that up. That would be many overheated forests may soon release more carbon than they absorb." The subhead, new research suggests that sooner than expected, trees may become carbon sources rather than carbon sinks as a feedback loop of rising temperatures drives them to release more greenhouse gases. And the article goes on to correctly point out sudden die-offs of trees, insect outbreaks that are killing trees around the world, and in many places forests are not growing back. This article indicates that new research shows that Earth's overheated climate will alter forests at a global scale even more fundamentally by tipping a critical greenhouse gas switch in the next few decades. The study suggests that by 2040, forests will only take up half as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as they do now. And most of that is reasonably stated, decent information, except for the decades in the distance time frame, of course, with which I generally take issue. And the article ends, or nearly ends, with the findings challenge the possibility of limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. Yeah, that train left the station a long time ago. What with the aerosol dimming that's going on, or aerosol masking or global dimming that's happening already, and the self-reinforcing feedback loops that have already been triggered. The paper on which the Inside Climate News paper relies, it was published in Science Advances. It's by Catherine Duffy and colleagues. And it's titled, "How Close Are We to the Temperature Tipping Point of the Terrestrial Biosphere?" Has some good stuff as well. We observe no evidence of acclimation in photosynthesis. That refers to the inability of plants to photosynthesize in light of increased levels of carbon dioxide, which has been a critical point for the deniers of the importance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for quite a long time. They claim that more carbon dioxide is exactly what plants need. After all, that's what we do in greenhouses, is increase the carbon dioxide content, and thereby reducing the barrier at the stomates, at the leaf level, to carbon dioxide getting into the plant. So more carbon dioxide must be better. And that's true, as I pointed out in my classes 30 years ago, with a mild exception. That's true if we're only increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But, as it turns out, we're increasing temperature at the global level and at the regional level as well. So increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the absence of other changes would undoubtedly increase plant growth. But there are other changes that are going on at the same time. The paper goes on, it is unlikely that acclimation will proceed with sufficient speed to compensate for temperature-induced declines. So the temperature-induced declines, again, refer to photosynthesis, and they are indicating that acclimation to the higher temperatures that's not going to keep up with the rapid rate of increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In contrast, here's what the paper reads. In contrast to any CO2 fertilization effect, anticipated higher temperatures associated with elevated CO2 could degrade land carbon uptake, and that failure to account for this results in a gross overestimation of climate change mitigation provided by terrestrial vegetation. Again, exactly right. Again, the kind of information I was teaching in my courses in 1990 and beyond, so for 30 years. The temperature tipping point of the terrestrial biosphere lies not at the end of the century or beyond, but within the next 20 or 30 years. This is the part that I take issue with, and that is what takes us to my climate change summary and update, last updated August 2nd, 2016, and let's look specifically at self-reinforcing feedback loop number 22. And here I point out that not a single paper mentioned in that first paragraph was cited by this paper in Science Advances. The entire first paragraph deals with drought-induced mortality of trees and contributing to increased decomposition of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and decreased sequestration of atmospheric carbon dioxide, what they referred to as adaptation, or in the Science Advances paper. So there's no adaptation going on. I go on to write, such mortality has been documented throughout the world since at least November 2000 in Nature, with recent summaries in the February 2013 issue of Nature for the Tropics, August 2013 issue of Frontiers in Plant Science for Temperate North America, and August 21st, 2015 issue of Science for Boreal Forests. None of these papers were cited in this recent paper in Science Advances. Ditto for everything that follows in the following paragraph on self-reinforcing feedback loop number 22. In the Amazon drought in 2010 led to the release of more carbon than the United States that year. This, according to a paper in Science from February 2011, not cited in the Science Advances paper. And again, the report from Geophysical Research Letters in July of 2013, not mentioned in this paper in Science Advances. An overview focused on the Amazon was provided by Climate News Network, March 5th, 2014, not cited. Paper in the March 19th, 2015 issue of Nature, not cited. Paper in the July 1st, 2016 issue of Global Biogeochemical Cycles, not cited. Skip down to the next paragraph. These results come from Nature Communications, and also I point to a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, again, not cited. And the abstract of the paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, affectionately called PNAS by scientists who publish there, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, PNAS. The abstract of the paper indicates that, quote, in contrast to existing predictions of either stability or catastrophic biomass loss, the Amazon forest's response to a drying regional climate is likely to be an immediate, graded, heterogeneous transition from high biomass moist forests to transitional dry forests and woody savanna-like states. And I was surprised and a little disappointed to see none of those papers cited because they all seem quite relevant to me. There are more as well, including in a couple of paragraphs down, February 21st, 2016 issue of Global Change Biology, and a March 10th, 2016 issue of Nature. None of those papers cited in this recent paper in Science Advances. So, I would argue that we have long passed the tipping point with respect to trees, photosynthesis, and respiration, and that as a consequence, this self-reinforcing feedback loop that they talk about as occurring as early as 2040 is already well underway. And this is based on research that I stopped doing August 2nd, 2016, so quite a long time ago. And again, it's surprising to me that these climate scientists are not keeping up with the relevant literature, even when that literature is relatively old. 1980 paper from Nature, for example, and maybe a dozen or 15 papers subsequently published that deal with this exact phenomenon. So that's a little surprising and disappointing. Not disappointing that they didn't cite my work. This is not about me. Disappointing that they didn't know about these other papers that are not difficult to find. I managed to do it in my spare time. And these folks are paid a pretty decent wage precisely to find that information and integrate it into their own papers. Great question, Brooklyn Culture Jam. How much negative feedback am I getting these days relative to previous years? It's pretty interesting. I don't think it's gone down. It has changed forms somewhat because I'm no longer on Facebook or Twitter, because I ignore other social media. There doesn't seem to be much coming at me from those versions of the toxic stew. And so that's the good news. I receive plenty of adverse information via email about what a terrible person I am. But I think for the most part that has declined primarily because of the organized defamation campaign that removed me from public service. So now I'm strictly a non-issue. Essentially, nobody hears of me anymore. I haven't been able to submit to an interview to the corporate media since 2017, basically. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. So what that means is there's no real need to attack me anymore because my ability to transmit my message has been destroyed. James, why haven't we all died yet? That's a fine question. I continue to be amazed at the resilience of industrial civilization. I thought that this whole house of cards would have come down long ago. And every time we get through another trading day on Wall Street without significant corrections, we'll say, I'm a little surprised. So, why aren't we dead yet? Because we still have habitat for humans on Earth. And I'm pretty happy about that, by the way. I'm scrolling through the comments looking for questions. So if I get quiet for a while, that's what's going on. Do we know the percentage globally of forests being a carbon emitter? Well, I don't, and that's a great question. I'm surprised nobody has taken on that question, because it's, given the satellite data, we have pretty good information on short notice of which forests at a variety of scales are emitting and taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So now that you mention it, I'm a little surprised somebody hasn't undertaken that study. That'd be a great study that an undergraduate, reasonably well-skilled in remote sensing, could take on, and it doesn't seem to me like it would be all that difficult. Why did I decide to move back to the USA? And actually, we decided to move back to the USA. And we did so. We moved back to New York because Pauline's baby sister had been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, sometimes called blood cancer. And so Pauline felt like her time would be better spent serving her family and dealing with that particular issue than living off-grid in an area with very poor telecommunications infrastructure, such as Belize. So we moved back originally for that purpose. Then we moved to Central Florida to help Pauline's father move here, where Pauline has two siblings, a brother and a sister, and then be able to conduct tests to determine what's going on with him. He clearly had memory issues. And sure enough, just a couple of weeks ago, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And Pauline has gone to dozens of appointments and spent thousands of hours making those appointments, taking her father to those appointments, and getting his life straightened out financially and physically, so that there is better support for him than can be provided for him when he lives in a 3-story walk-up apartment in Chicago, which is where he came from and had been living for some 25 years. Okay, so that's why we're back in the USA. No representation. Were you officially banned from Facebook and other social apps? No, stunningly, I wasn't. In the early days when I was presenting the information I have subsequently become known for, essentially every one of my videos was removed. I would deliver a presentation, somebody would record it for me, they would post it on Facebook, and it would disappear immediately. And so people were constantly, not me because I don't know what the hell I'm doing, but Pauline and a couple of other people who shot video on my behalf would upload that information, and then it would immediately be removed. But I have never been banned from Facebook or Twitter or any other social media apps, and I'm a little surprised about that, because of the information that I've been presenting. I voluntarily left Facebook and Twitter a few months ago. I don't remember exactly when. And my life has been much more my own since then, and I feel great about leaving those two particular toxic stews. I'm still on LinkedIn, but that's a far more professional format than Facebook or Twitter, so I can share information there. Basically, nobody sees it, in contrast to what goes on Facebook and Twitter. But after presenting this information for many years, I feel like I had reached the people who were going to be reached, who were capable of being reached, because they were open-minded enough to be receptive to my message. And then the defamation campaign came along in 2017 and pretty much destroyed my ability to continue doing that work. So now I'm trying to live my message to a far greater extent than I was before. What should we expect in this new year? I think more of the same, and I think we escaped the loss of aerosol masking and the resulting impacts because of the time of year the pandemic broke out and also the time of year that the third wave occurred. So for the first and third waves, we were largely in periods of time in the northern hemisphere when biological activity was minimized. So notice the COVID-19 pandemic broke out in winter, and so trees were all dormant. Other plants in the northern hemisphere were dormant. So there was very little impact on plant life and therefore on plant community life, and the response of the ecosystem was quite muted. And then by the time the third wave came along, we were into the fall in the northern hemisphere at the end of last year. So I think we were quite fortunate with respect to the timing. And if we are not so lucky next time around, I think the impacts will be felt far more directly on humans through significant crop reduction, for example, and even more catastrophic loss of trees, as is pointed out by this latest paper in Science Advances. So I think we can expect an acceleration of what we've been seeing so far. Will that lead to a significant loss in grain production so that maybe we peaked in the last year or two and the crop production will decline significantly, and that will cause this set of living arrangements to decay even further? Maybe so. It certainly wouldn't surprise me. Let's see. Yeah. Yes, absolutely, with respect to the next oil shock. The next oil shock certainly could be on its way. And interestingly, I think COVID-19 has again provided another advantage with respect to timing. Demand is way down for oil and gas, for fossil fuels generally, because people are not going anywhere. People are not traveling as much as they were. A lot of people are working from home, so that saves the daily commute. So that has profoundly decreased the demand for oil and gas. So that's been, again, quite fortunate for humans with respect to retention of our habitat. Thank you, Sandra, for joining the NatureBat's Last YouTube channel as a climate defender. Oh, Grateful Dan says, since geoengineering will not fix the planet's oceans dying due to human activity, can you explain, in your opinion, how humans will lose habitat due to dead oceans? Yeah, lack of food. Lack of food for one, loss of phytoplankton for another. And the phytoplankton in the ocean provides approximately 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. Approximately the other 50% comes from terrestrial systems, most notably the Amazon basin. So, two sources of potential loss of habitat for human beings: the loss of food, which is significant, perhaps not for you in particular, but for many people around the world. Think about, it wasn't that long ago, 10,000 years ago, probably 70 or 80% of the people on the planet lived within a few kilometers of the ocean, because that's where the food was. There's an enormous amount of food that still comes from the ocean, obviously, and the subsequent decline in food supply as a result of a couple of things I've talked about before: loss of the phytoplankton, base of the marine food web, and also the toxicity of ocean acidification for the organisms. So we're already seeing the shifting baseline with respect to large fish. All the large fish are effectively gone. I'm sure many of you have seen those old pictures of Ernest Hemingway, for example, holding up the marlin that he caught, and the thing's 12 feet long. He's not holding it up. He's standing beside it while it's being held up by a rope or a cable. And, You haven't seen one of those pictures lately. I'm not talking about with Ernest Hemingway. I know he's not alive anymore. But you haven't seen many of those 12-foot marlins anymore either. These days, a big fish caught from the ocean is 4 or 5 feet long. A third or half as long as the big fish used to be. So that's very important. What do I think of the president of Brazil being sued by Amazon natives? I had no idea, because I pay so little attention to politics, domestic or foreign. Razi Eco Warrior, I want to point out a slight error there. You say we are 3 meals short of anarchy. We are actually 3 meals short of chaos. Anarchism. Chaos is the absence of rules. Anarchism is the absence of rulers. Anarchism, I'm going to quote from Edward Abbey here. Anarchism is not a romantic fable, but the hard-headed realization, based on 5,000 years of experience, that we cannot entrust the management of our lives to kings, priests, politicians, generals, and county commissioners. Anarchists take responsibility for themselves and for their neighbors, human and otherwise. And that's an important distinction from chaos. Greta says, time will tell if Biden administration fulfills promises on climate change. I don't think it'll take very long either. Do I have a citation for the melting down of the 450 nuclear reactors? Do you mean for the fact that they will melt down when humans stop caring about their maintenance and instead go to spend time at home with their families? Or do you mean the resultant stripping away of the atmosphere when that occurs? Because I have references for both of those. The first is the reference of common sense. Even first responders stop responding when a crisis impacts their home life, their family life. When a crisis becomes too big for first responders, they tend to go home to try to protect their own, rather than serving as a public servant. Thank you, James Gilchrist, and welcome to the Nature Bats Last channel as a climate defender. And similarly, thank you, Sandra Rapash. Pretty sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Welcome to the Nature Bats Last channel as a climate defender as well. Oh, can I briefly describe what a 2C and 3C world would look like, respectively? No, I can't. Humans have never occupied a 2C or a 3C world. And what's far more important than the number itself, what's far more important than 2C or 2.5C or 3C or 7C is the rate at which we get there. We are already outstripping the ability of vertebrates to keep up by a factor of 10,000 times, as I pointed out in the peer-reviewed literature many times. Mammals can't keep up either, as I pointed out a few times. So the rate of change is what's critically important, and I suspect what that means is a 2 or a 3C world has few, if any, humans, and the catastrophic meltdown of a whole bunch of nuclear power plants, and the loss of most complex life on Earth, perhaps all, in the very near term, because of the process of co-extinctions pointed out by Strona and Bradshaw in their November 2018 paper in Scientific Reports. David asks for Guy and Pauline both to answer this question. What is your favorite Bernie meme? And I'm an anarchist. I don't follow politics really at all. In fact, that meme of Bernie sitting in a chair with those mittens on was brought to my individual attention by 100 people probably. And that's the only reason I know about that meme. That's the only Bernie meme I've ever seen that I can recall. So that would have to be my favorite because it's my only. Raza Eco Warrior, it's perfectly okay if you eat me if I'm dead in the future. I got no problem with that. I hope to continue to be useful after I'm dead. Edward Abbey said something about among the best things that could happen to the human body was that it be chewed up by wild birds or wild organisms of some kind. And I couldn't agree more with that. Okay, 2 questions from Jimmy John. Has Paul Beckwith ever said anything to me off camera that indicates he may be on the same page as you in regards to near-term human extinction? No, never. You have to bear in mind that he has a lot of privilege to lose between now and then. Also, what are your thoughts on David Wasdell? I haven't really kept track of Wasdell's work. I cited some of his work years ago, but that's all I know about him. I think it was from a report he wrote, maybe a presentation, but I think a report that he wrote. But this goes back many years. And so I don't have much of an opinion. And if he has produced anything recently, I haven't seen it. So I have no good reason to dislike him because I don't know what he's up to. Oh yeah, James Gilchrist, you're very confused about this. Life flourished back in the time of the dinosaurs, and the world was much hotter back then. As the planet gets warmer, life prospers. No, it does not. It did previously, because it took a long time to get there, and it stayed at that temperature for a very long time. It's all about the rate of change. This is something that almost nobody... All right, we're live again, I think. Anybody give me an indication of whether you can hear me? It appears we were hacked. So I don't think we violated any community rules, and yet that's the story we were told. So there you have it. I've been hacked repeatedly, Jimmy John, to answer your question. Many, many, many times, dating back at least several years. The most interesting case, I was at a conference, a hacker conference of all things, outside of Amsterdam. It was completely off-grid, and yet it had more bandwidth than Africa. I was hacked right before the conference started. 4 people wrote to me and said, hey, I can fix that for you if you'd like. And I turned them all down, and I said, the host is going to fix it. At the time, I think it was HostGator was hosting my site, and I'd written to them, and they didn't do anything. And I finally figured out they're not going to do anything. So the 5th person who contacted me, I told him yes, then I thought about it, and I asked him to fix it. And I gave him my login credentials, and he wrote back and said, it's fixed. And by the way, these are your login credentials, not the information you sent me. So he was such an amazingly good hacker that he fixed the website within a couple of hours, and he was able to hack into it without having the login credentials that I had apparently misplaced. Regarding the loss of plankton, 50% of oxygen, will people be able to breathe properly, or will it make us living zombies like those in DC? Good question. Well said. And already in many cities around the world, the ability to access oxygen is making people's cognition decline. So less oxygen is the last thing we need in Washington, D.C. and beyond. Again, the rate of change here is critically important. Increased carbon dioxide, lower oxygen in the atmosphere is bad news, and it will have negative impacts on every organism that depends upon oxygen for survival. And that means vertebrates and mammals and reptiles and any number of other organisms. And there is absolutely no guarantee bacteria will carry on. The paper by Strona and Bradshaw says 5 to 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise is enough to kill all life on Earth. We're headed there very quickly, well beyond 5 to 6 C. So I strongly suspect we're going to leave this rock as a rock with no life. I can't imagine any way to avoid that at this point. Never mind the catastrophic meltdown of the world's nuclear power plants, stripping away the atmosphere. Without an atmosphere, not even bacteria survive. Okay, sorry for the disruption, folks. Thanks for joining us again. And I'm not sure that everybody knows because we have a new link. So I don't know if everybody was able to jump. Perhaps somebody can answer me this, one or two people from the chat. How did you get back in? How did you know there was a new link? Was it a new link? Am I confused about this and most other things? Please send me a little chat message and let us know. Do I suspect that the government pays people to inhibit my message? Yes. And this kind of activity has been reported for many years now, at least 8 years that I have read reports of government entities and also people who cannot be identified, which screams government at me, paying people to be trolls, basically, or to be hackers. There's some very talented people out there. Welcome, Bell Creek, to the Nature Bat's Last channel on YouTube as a member. Thank you very much for joining. Okay. So apparently everybody was able to just refresh the YouTube page. I tried that. It didn't work for me. But I'm a Luddite, so that might explain part of my problem. Oh, and somebody got a notification. All right. Well, that's good. Jimmy John asks if there are other sources of aerosols that are not produced as a result of industrial activity. Yes. I mentioned this on one of these live streams maybe a month or so ago. The Himalayas are a source of aerosols of considerable significance. And the first study on the topic in the peer-reviewed literature just basically discovered that the Himalayas were producing an enormous amount of aerosols. And I haven't seen any further information about that, and I did not see any comparison of the Himalayas and those aerosols relative to fossil fuels. It seemed to be a regional phenomenon, and I pointed out at the time that there's a lot we don't know. So I haven't seen subsequent information. There may be other sources as well that I'm just not aware of, or that we generally are not aware of at this point. That was new to me, this study in the Himalayas, and apparently it was a surprise to the researchers as well. Jim and John, I've been looking into that question for at least a year now. How many degrees C can we expect immediately following an ice-free summer Arctic? Now, because of the change in albedo, there will be a significant, very rapid rise in global average temperature. And I've dug around in all the peer-reviewed literature I can track down for that topic, and it seems that would be certainly enough to destroy industrial civilization, because we're so close to the brink already, and the very rapid rate of change following an ice-free Arctic as a result of loss of albedo would trigger a very rapid environmental change induced by a very rapid global average temperature rise. And I haven't been able to find out how much by adding together all the relevant pieces of that particular puzzle. There's the latent heat. That is, the heat that goes into the ocean is being absorbed by the ice to allow the ice to melt. That takes an enormous amount of energy to melt ice. Once the ice is gone, that same amount of energy is going into heating the water. That's huge, and I haven't seen anybody address how huge that would be, because I think it's difficult to characterize the volume of the Arctic Ocean, at least in the upper layers. So there's at least the albedo, the loss of aerosol masking resulting from destruction or near destruction of industrial activities. There's the latent heat issue. There may be others, I don't know. But it seems to me it would be, the rapidity of the change would be enormous. And whether that would produce 5 or 6 degrees temperature rise sufficient to destroy all life on Earth, I don't know. But it brings with it the uncontrolled meltdown of the world's nuclear power plants. So one way or another, I think we're headed for a lifeless planet. Not by next Tuesday, and not even by next year, but I think it's not far away relative to the kinds of temporal spans paleoecologists use, for example. Do I agree with the theory that the jet stream will shift towards Greenland following a blue ocean event? Beckwith predicts crop growing region will shift towards Canada. Can the same crops be grown there? No, of course not. Again, complete lack of understanding of biology and ecology by Mr. Beckwith. And like so many people, he thinks that we can just pick up all the grain that is growing in the enormously productive mollisol soils that are found in the American Great Plains, and just pick it up and move it to the spodosols, the soils that in the North Country will not support productive grain crops. So that's absolute nonsense. It's not as if the world is homogeneous and we can just pick up plants from one place and grow them in another. That's not going to happen. That has never happened. Given the rate of change, there is no way that we can take crop plants and move them from one place to another. That's ridiculous and not surprising considering the source. But that said, I do not know. We're entering a whole new world. The kind of heating that humans obviously have never experienced before. So it's very difficult to predict what will happen in the future, and we can't even use the paleo record as any sort of basis to tell us where we're headed, because again, the rate of change this time is so much faster than it's ever been before. So the jet stream might shift towards Greenland, or maybe it won't. I don't think we have enough information to make that kind of prediction. I think we have enough information to predict that the loss of vertebrate mammals and the loss of all life on Earth is going to happen, but not by Tuesday and not even by the end of this year. Jimmy John points out that Shakova expects methane fluxes to increase 5% annually for the next 50 years, and we don't have 50 years. How would this kind of conservative projection affect yours and Karana's 2026 prediction? You have to bear in mind that prediction of Karana's and my adoption of that prediction is based only to a very small extent on methane getting into the atmosphere. So I pointed out in my latest peer-reviewed journal article that there are 7 different ways that we could lose habitat for humans in the near future. Methane in the atmosphere is one of those ways. So there are many ways we can drive ourselves to extinction. As a consequence, this conservative projection affects my prediction not at all. Have I seen any new research on methane? Actually, in my presentations going back probably a year and a half, when I did my latest tour, March and April, in Alaska and then California and then Oregon, if you look on the Nature Bat's last blog, GuyMcPherson.com, and poke around in those presentations from that tour, I suspect you'll see me mention quite a few times that there are peer-reviewed articles not conducted by Shakova's research group pointing to methane release into the atmosphere being much worse than people like Michael Mann, for example, and others are predicting. That's a good point, Pauline. Anyone who's ever gardened, even on a small scale, quickly figures out that micro ecosystems are everywhere and that there are microclimates that make a tremendous importance. One part of a garden will grow a nice head of lettuce, another part of the garden won't. So these microclimates are critically important, and the notion that we can pick up a bunch of plants and move them to a completely different soil is kind of silly. What are some important extinction cascades to look out for? What kind of co-extinctions do you think precede human extinction? Exactly the kinds of things we're seeing today. Loss of habitat for vertebrates, loss of habitat for mammals, well underway, and predicted and projected to be much higher. I would encourage everybody to read the latest paper senior authored by Gerardo Ceballos. It came out middle of last year, as I recall, middle of 2020. And I'm trying to find the citation without immediate success. And I'm not having luck. But it's easy to find, to track down. It's an open access journal that it was published in. Senior author is Gerardo Ceballos, and other authors include Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven. And the paper points out that vertebrates are on the brink as a result of ongoing changes in the environment. So I think we are, as pointed out in the latest paper by Gerardo Ceballos and Paul Ehrlich and Peter Raven, I think that we are already on the brink, that we are observing exactly what we would expect in light of co-extinctions. A bunch of species that look in many ways like us, resemble in many ways us, are already going extinct, are already losing habitat around the world. As are we, by the way, as pointed out in the 2020 paper by Colin Raymond and colleagues in Science Advances, pointing to exceeding lethal wet bulb temperatures in the tropics and subtropics. And that's for now, but what about next year? Nothing is getting any better. What are some ways we can protect wildlife/ecosystem from the coming bottleneck for as long as possible? These ways have been well studied and well implemented by wildlife biologists and conservation biologists essentially forever. Anything we can do to establish reserves, as Kevin Hester is trying to do with respect to a marine reserve off the New Zealand coast, that's a great idea. Anything we can do to minimize human activity in relatively large areas. One definition of wilderness that I particularly like is that it is a sufficient size and variation that it allows for natural selection. So that's taking the long view. That is taking the very long view when it comes to habitat. Habitat necessarily includes reproduction by the organism in question. So those are the kinds of things that we can do, is protect very large areas for as long as possible. James wondering what the loss of flight traffic due to the pandemic had on the aerosol masking effect. The aerosol masking effect is different from the effect of contrails. The effect of contrails is much shorter lived. We're talking about the magnitude of a day or two. And so once the planes stop flying, the impact is virtually immediate, and the recovery is likewise almost immediate. So I haven't seen any peer-reviewed articles on that particular topic. So that would be interesting to look into. How has the refreeze been in the Arctic this year? Is it behind where it should be, especially with March closing in? I haven't actually looked for the last few weeks, so I don't know, but there are several sources of Arctic ice volume and extent that are readily publicly available. Bell Creek, thanks for your first question as a member. Would you say the recent weather events in Spain are an indicator of the jet stream seriously going wrong? Yes, absolutely. The jet stream and also the Gulf Stream, the thermohaline conveyor belt, as it's called, that transports water from the warm tropical Atlantic up to and along the coast, along the western coast of Europe, thereby bringing warm, wet air to that region, has been critically important in maintaining the Mediterranean climate. All bets are off now. It's crazy time. Delana says, my crepe myrtle that was planted above a broken water pipe grew much bigger than the other ones. Maybe water was the limiting factor there. Kind of sounds like it to me. So, James, I would recommend not telling your mom about this anymore. She's going to become angry and shout, especially if she's shouting at you. I would run away. Some people do not want to have the conversation. They are not emotionally and cognitively capable of having the conversation. So why bother? Get on with your life. Jimmy John, according to mirrors, one mirror can remove 1 ton of CO2. If we produce 100 million tons of CO2 per day without mentioning feedbacks, how is this a viable solution? It's a viable solution only if it scales up, obviously. And it can be scaled up relatively quickly. It relies upon materials that are readily and inexpensively available. So if the mirror reflection project had the kind of support that your typical billionaire could provide without even noticing, it could be scaled up within a year to produce profound impacts on retention of habitat for humans. Casper asked, do you know to some extent what effect the year 2020 has had on the aerosol masking effect? And I reported on this a few times. The timing was perfect. The reduction in industrial activity apparently was insufficient to cause a relatively long-term loss of aerosol masking at the time of year that would have been catastrophic. So again, the first and third waves of the pandemic occurred at the perfect time in terms of retention of habitat for humans in the winter, late fall, early spring. So if we have those kinds of events happening during the spring and summer, then we're in a world of hurt, because all of the impacts on the climate, especially the short-term impacts, have to be mediated through plant life before we will feel them, before we will notice them. And when that happens, we are in real trouble. James Gilchrist says, my coworker said that Guy McPherson is just like a televangelist who always says the world is coming to an end. Always? You know, the televangelists actually make money at their gig. Me, not so much. In fact, the transmission of my message by me has pretty much destroyed my life. So I think that's not an appropriate analog. HM, welcome to the NaturePat's Last YouTube channel as a member, specifically as a climate defender. Thank you very much for joining the channel as a member. No representation. I think you can conclude that a 20% loss of aerosols then is not sufficient to get global damming impact loss felt. I disagree completely. I think 20% will do the trick. It's all about the timing. This is something that I've explained a few thousand times to people who are not conservation biologists. This is a primary reason I think climate scientists have been missing the boat for at least 100 years. It's all about the timing. It's all about the rate of change. It's all about the season. And nobody is looking at any of those factors. There is only a 6 or 7% decline in carbon dioxide output. If that corresponds to industrial activity, then it's only a 6 or 7% decline in industrial activity. We probably had more than 20% decline in industrial activity at various places, at various locations around the planet, originally around Wuhan in China. And sure enough, profound increases in temperature in that region were noted. Same thing when the coronavirus caused a reduction in industrial activity in India. Profound increase in temperature relative to long-term averages. Same thing happened next in a relatively large area in Eurasia, and then finally in the northeastern United States. But it was region by region. It wasn't all in one place at the same time. So your ability to reach conclusions in the absence of evidence is no surprise, because this is sort of pushback I've been receiving for a very long time, never rooted in evidence. As I mentioned once before, Jimmy John, I have a copy of The Mind Illuminated. It was given to me by a friend, and I have read some parts of it, but not the whole thing. No representation. If you were hearing 20% reduction in industrial activity worldwide, then please send me that link, because I've never seen anything close to that. HM sends $5, and apparently that's to ask me the question, do I have any tattoos? Well, not one. Not a single tattoo. I'm not anti-tattoo. I just never felt like it was a good use of my money. So I never got a tattoo. And no, that does not mean that if you send me $1,000 to get a tattoo, I'm going to get a tattoo. Delana wants to know what I learned living off-grid in terms of survival tactics, how to grow food, and so forth. And the reason I no longer live off-grid is that I believe it's more important for me to transmit this message and have access to very good telecommunications infrastructure to do so, despite what happened earlier this evening. I think that's more important than my own personal survival for a few weeks or maybe months beyond reduction in industrial activity. And once I discovered the full impact of aerosol masking, that's when I concluded that it didn't make sense for me to live off-grid in a remote region where I no longer had access to the ability to provide this message. So that's why I'm doing this. I don't think that you can significantly extend your life by knowing how to grow food, because the climate will change profoundly in the not too distant future, and that means the weather will change profoundly, and your ability to grow food will be seriously threatened, much less the ability to husband various small animals, ranging from chickens to goats, with ducks and turkeys in there in between, and the occasional goose. So, at least for me, it doesn't make sense to provide what might be a few hours or a few days extension of my life, what might be a few weeks or a few months. For me, it doesn't make sense to chase that particular extended lifespan and give up the ability to provide this message in a room that we've turned into a studio and allows conversations such as this one. Where many? Where many? Where many? Where her many? Well, anyway, however you pronounce that. Thank you very much for joining the Nature Bad's Last YouTube channel as a climate defender. I think that makes 3 or 4 people who have joined just this evening, so thanks to each of you. Jimmy John, please include a link. I can't keep track based on the title of everything I've read in the last few months, much less years. If I could punch one mainstream climate scientist in the face, would it be Michael Mann? Blink twice if yes. I don't think I would punch anybody in the face, actually. Well, I take that back. I don't think I would punch climate scientists in the face. I have a lot of people who have betrayed me, but none of those climate scientists were personal friends of mine, so therefore they're not in a position to betray me. All right. We're going to wrap this up. Look at that. It's an hour and a half with only about 15 or 20 minutes of that chasing around trying to get the system back online. So thank you, everybody, for joining today. Thanks for the discussion. Thank you for asking questions, some of which I was able to respond to in a reasonable manner. And I apologize for the ones that I don't. And Jimmy John, please, if you can't find the link now, please send me the link via email, guy.r.mcpherson@gmail.com. And that information, my email address, is readily available at guymcpherson.com. So please send me the link to the paper that you're looking at, and I will address that topic with our next live stream, which will be in another week or two. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. And no, Delana, our government is not going to tell us that the end is coming. Yes, Hal was nicer to the astronauts than our government is to us. No question about that. You know, a few people enjoy an enormous amount of privilege, and the notion of that privilege going away is not something that they would like to happen. So I don't think any government is going to sound the alarm anytime soon with actual evidence pointing to our imminent demise. And I strongly suspect instead they will continue doing what governments around the world have always done since governments first arose, and that's lie. That's lie by omission or lie by commission, not telling the truth in myriad ways. And the bottom line in every case is retention of privilege for some people and not for the rest. Thank you everybody for joining in, and I look forward to doing this next time around, presumably in a week or two. So please stay tuned to GuyMcPherson.com, where the next live stream will be announced at least a few days in advance.